The Nerdcast Empire is on the air. It is Music Monday once again on the Nerdcast Empire. Great to have you along with us again. I am Matt in the studio. Joining us once again in studio for another edition of Music Monday. This is our third episode of Music Monday. It's Mike. Mike, how's it going?
It is going pretty well. Another good week of music.
A lot of great music this week. I think it was really tough to kind of narrow it down to our 6 favorite album releases. But we're going to do our best to do that, and helping us do that once again from Parts Unknown is Chris. Chris, how's it going?
It's going great. Wrapping up the into another weekend. Happy that the Parts Unknown deities have let this parallel universe overlap with yours again.
Definitely looking forward to hearing what you have from Parts Unknown on your music choices for this week. It was a really good week, and these are releases from the week of February the 16th. So we're going to be going through the rock and metal releases for that week and trying to find 2 albums each that will be our choices for the new music of the week. And then we come back in the second segment of the show. We're each going to go into the vault, talk about an album from the past that's either influential to us or potentially just something we want to point out to the listeners, and we'll do that. Also want to take a moment to thank everybody for what was a great week last week on the Nerdcast Empire. I believe it was our largest download week in our very short history. But very cool. We really appreciate all the support. And as we've said before, if people do nothing but listen to our podcast, share our posts on social media, that is the biggest thing you can do to help us out and expands our reach. If you're on one of the big platforms, leave us a positive review. That's a big help. Helps us with the algorithm, all that good stuff. We do have a store. You're welcome to buy some merch for the Nerdcast Empire. But again, we're just happy that you listen and share our posts on social media. That'll be a big help. Let's get to Music Monday. We're going to start out with Mike. Mike, a lot of really great music to go through this weekend. And I think maybe the most diverse group of new albums that we have chosen this week. But you're going to get us started with what is your first choice of the week?
Yeah, definitely a lot of diversity this week. And I think what's interesting about this week, especially with my choices, is not only did I find music that I enjoyed, but it turns out as I dug a little deeper into the albums themselves, some interesting stories too. So I want to start that off with my first pick. The artist's name is Leah, who is Leah McHenry, and her album, The Glory and the Fallen.
Yeah, this is one of the more interesting stories. And there are some interesting stories this week, but this may be the most interesting how this album came about.
Yeah, so Leah McHenry, as I mentioned, she is from Vancouver, British Columbia, and this is her 6th album. She actually crowdfunded it through Kickstarter with a goal, I believe, of somewhere around 27,000 Canadian dollars, if I remember correctly. Ended up raising 111,000 Canadian dollars.
That's pretty good.
Now, that being said, I looked at, this is after the campaign's over, so I couldn't have pledged, but among some of the perks you get for pledging, if you actually went to the highest tier, which was 1,340 Canadian dollars, or roughly close to $1,000 US, part of some of what you would get would include, well, most notably, a custom collector sword, along with, the 3-disc digibook, candle set, t-shirt, hoodie, signed photo. So, I mean, the sword stuck out to me, but still, that's definitely thinking outside the box, and kind of her thing seems to be, as someone who doesn't tour, she's very good at kind of marketing and getting the word out about her music without the aid of live touring.
And I think that's a new trend. I think not just in music, but across all forms of entertainment. If you don't have to leave your area, why leave your area? But all that stuff wouldn't have mattered if the music wasn't any good. And the bottom line is this album is really outstanding.
Yeah, I was very impressed with the album. Features guest appearances from Mark Jansen from the band Epica, another good band, a couple former and current Delane members. So if you're into symphonic metal, you probably know Delane, another great band. But her sound is very similar to that. Definitely Celtic, symphonic, very, very high fantasy sounding metal. But yeah, if that's the kind of thing you're into, then this is definitely an album for you.
I mean, you look at the groups that she's collaborated with, groups like Testament, Dragon Lord, Delane, Vengeance, Blind Guardian, Nightwish. Like you said, I mean, it's right up the alley of someone, if you like symphonic metal, especially European symphonic metal, even though she's obviously Canadian, you're going to find a lot on this album that you're really going to like.
Yeah, and then that's kind of what I did as I went through the tracks on this album. a decent amount of diversity even within the album. I mean, she has a very just classic female symphonic metal voice, but definitely some cool kind of mixture of male vocals in a song like was it Sleeping Giant had a really cool kind of growling vocal mixed in with hers. I thought that was really neat. Yeah, I mean, she's been around since 2012. Her website kind of describes her music saying, from ethereal ballads to folktales, mysterious world instrumentation, and operatic blast beats, Leah's voice is a breath of fresh air in a sea of female-fronted rock. And, you know, I tend to agree with that. Not bad for a homeschooling mother of 5 from British Columbia.
It was funny because Wikipedia said she's sometimes called the Enya of heavy metal, which
I saw that as well.
Pretty interesting description, but great album. Certainly really enjoyed that. Chris, your thoughts on Leah and the Glory and the Fallen?
Yeah, when I took a listen to this, I almost thought of it. It's about as close as you can get to period piece music as you can get. Just maybe not a period piece of this world, but more of a fantastical world, I guess. And as soon as I heard it, I thought, this would be something perfect right up the alley for a game like Elder Scrolls or Elden Ring, one of those fantasy style games. And then come to find out that she's actually worked on kind of some tribute songs to games like Skyrim.
So yeah, just kind of fitting that her music goes right along with those types of games.
Not surprising at all. I was listening to it today when I went for a walk, and I was almost certain a dragon was going to pop up at any moment. It definitely made the walk more enjoyable.
Definitely a great album. Check that out from Leah, The Glory and the Fallen. You got 2 great choices this week. That was number 1. What is number 2?
Yeah, number 2, I kind of went to the other side of the world, Brisbane, Australia, with the band A Somerset Parade and their newest album, Carcosa.
Yeah, I think if you had a spectrum of your music, these 2 are definitely not on the same end of the spectrum, but good in a different way.
Yeah, this band started in 2015 kind of as a pop punk, or as they put it, an easy core band, which is a new term for me. I've heard of numerous types of cores in music. Easy core's a new one, though.
The Marine Corps.
Yeah, the Marine Corps designed it, actually, and your front core and your back core. In 2019, they kind of darkened their sound a bit. They're being more compared to being a metalcore or new metal band now, which I think really works well on this new album. They still kind of have that pop punk melody, but definitely a darker edge.
I saw one review that said that they were intriguing industrial metal meets synthwave sound, as they describe as dark, visceral, and emotional. I think that kind of fits. Yeah,
it's funny. On several of their social pages, I think Bandcamp and Facebook, they just refer to themselves as industrial rock, which I think there is some of that there, but I think that just scratches the surface at best of what their overall sound is. There's just a lot more to it.
Yeah, it's definitely more complicated than that. I think if you were just looking for industrial rock, you're probably going to have to search for it in their music because there's a lot of other layers going on there.
And I mentioned earlier that this week was full of kind of some interesting albums as far as inspirations and what got them there. I found out via a review from Bob from theprogspace.com. This album was actually inspired by a book, The King in Yellow, which is a collection of short horror stories by Robert Chambers that was first published in 1895. Moreover, the album title, Carcosa, is actually inspired from another short story by Ambrose Bierce entitled An Inhabitant of Carcosa. So definitely a little more depth to what they're writing about than maybe you'd normally see in your typical new metal band.
Yeah, which is kind of surprising because you think new metal, it sometimes is very superficial. This is definitely a level of depth that I don't think a lot of new metal bands are bringing to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you want kind of more of that melodic side, a song like Beyond the Ropes is really good. They have a video for their track Mirror White, which actually debuted a little earlier, a few months back at the end of last year. But that's definitely up there as far as top songs for me for the year.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting release. Chris, your thoughts on this album? Definitely different than the Leah release, which was his first choice.
Yeah, Mike definitely had a wide variety here. I will say, though, like if there's any similarity between them, it's definitely that I could see each one of your picks in a video game setting, just not the same video game setting. When I listened to this band, the first thing I heard was these backing instruments sound almost like they should be in Doom or a Doom game.
Yeah, definitely.
From nowadays. It fit right in there, and the growling vocals that were in it were at just the right level to where it didn't turn me off and pulled me in. And I mean, I was interested as soon as you labeled this as one of your picks for us in the Discord, and I search them, and the first hashtag I see is progressive metalcore. I just needed to know more.
Yeah, definitely interesting sound for sure. I think one that I'd definitely like to check out a little bit more from them. So two very, very good choices, very different choices for your music choices this week. We're going to move to Parts Unknown and get to Chris. And Chris has two very excellent, but also very different choices on your list this week. Chris, what is your first choice?
Yeah, my first pick, and it's one that I've listened to probably at least half a dozen times already this week, is Bokassa, All Out of Dreams. They are a Norwegian power trio. They've been around since 2016. And to describe their sound, I think they put it best. They fuse stoner rock and metal with catchy punk rock into their own brand of stoner punk. The album just absolutely rips as soon as it opens from the first song, and it doesn't let up. It gets in your face. Some of my favorite tracks are just the opening tracks. The ending starts today, like I said, gets right in your face. He's got kind of a Wayne Static-esque sound to his voice with kind of gravel in it, and I absolutely love it. And they follow the opening track up with another great song called Garden of Heathen, which if you're into a band that has great titles, this is right up your alley. You got Straight Edgelord, Bradford Death Squadron. And even from their previous album names, we've got Molotov Rocktail.
Nice.
So these guys are great with coming up with clever albums, but I want to kind of jump into their Spotify because it seems to me from the story that I've read on here is they should be way more popular than they are. I mean, they do have over 55,000 monthly listeners, but this is a band who has backed Metallica. They were handpicked by Lars Ulrich to support Metallica alongside Ghost on their stadium tour all over Europe. And the legendary drummer hailed them as his favorite new band, described them as insanely effing cool. And after hearing the trio's first album, Divide and Conquer. So if it's got Lars Ulrich's pick, then I'd say they're going to be right up any metalhead's alley. I say one concerning note is I noticed that right after this newest album was released, they did part ways with their bassist amicably. So they are working on getting a bassist to follow them around on tour. No big plans for a steady replacement yet, but hopefully they can keep touring, keep up the act, and come out with some more amazing albums.
One thing about both of Chris's choices this week is I felt like when I initially kind of checked them out, like the one track, because you do a great job of putting together a playlist that has one of the songs from the album to kind of give you a taste of what you're listening to. And both of them, they were fine. But it's like both of these bands, the more I got into the album a little bit deeper, the more I really enjoyed the sound. I thought these guys, a very interesting sound. And I think the stuff kind of deeper on the album is really, really good.
Yeah, one thing I found about them is that even though they kind of hail themselves as a stoner rock band and they kind of mention all these other influences, there's so much more than all of that. They're not too much of any one thing, but because of that, I feel like their sound is much better for it. Like their vocalist kind of sounds like a stoner rock vocalist, but has more range than what we typically run into with those bands. So much about it was just the right levels of everything. And the little chiptune intro to the title track was phenomenal.
Yeah, 100%. It was just so different. I wasn't really expecting it, but it was really good. I think definitely a group I want to check out more from. As so often happens on this podcast, you find these new groups.
Amazing album cover too. I mean, it's worth it just to check out the album cover. I honestly want to get that on a t-shirt.
They probably sell that t-shirt. You can probably get that somewhere without a doubt.
Yep, just found it.
There you go.
Not surprising.
So that's a really good first choice, Chris. I really like your second choice as well. What was your second choice for this week?
Yeah, my second choice was a band called Art of Anarchy with their latest album, Let There Be Anarchy. And this was a band, I think Mike put it best, is when we first heard it, we felt like there was something more. Like this band has hit points where it doesn't seem like they're just an up-and-coming artist. And come to find out that they have a storied history where when they first started, they actually had Scott Weiland as lead vocalist. And one of their albums was actually the last release before he passed away. So sadly, they had to find a new artist. And then they went with Scott Stapp, formerly of Creed. So that was an interesting selection. Released an album with him. And now the band consists of the brothers John Vada, Vince Vada, They have guitarist Ron Bumblefoot Thal from Guns N' Roses, Sons of the Apollo. And now they have replaced Scott Stapp with Jeff Scott Soto, formerly of Yngwie Malmsteen and Sons of the Apollo. Trying to describe their music, I mean, they put on here, it's one of those rare bands that doesn't play by the rules except for the ones that they break. Compromise and playing it safe are terms that don't exist in their vocabulary. Pulverizing raw talent is what this band has always relied on. They have kind of a darker sound to them, more of a melodic sound compared to Bokassa. Some of my favorite songs off the albums are Vilified and Bridge of Tomorrow, tracks 3 and 4 off the new album.
We could spend a whole episode talking about Jeff Scott Soto, and
Yeah.
maybe we will somewhere down the line, because maybe one of the all-time great metal vocalists, and to bring him in is certainly a genius move. Of all the albums that we looked at, this was the one where, when I was putting together my preview and my notes, and I was working on pulling all the social media information, this was the one that stayed on the background when the other ones I might have clicked off and started moving to the next thing. And with every track that followed, starting with Vilified, now they're all great, but starting with Vilified and just continuing on, just one track after another just got better and better. They've got such a fantastic sound. They are clearly playing on a different level than a lot of the other bands that we are going to talk about this week. But man, this was so good. And I hope that this gets some consideration potentially for one of the best metal albums of the year, because I think it's on that kind of level.
I think Jeff Scott Soto is definitely underrated as far as you never hear him mentioned amongst the great metal vocalists, but his credits are ridiculous to look at. Yeah, I'm mostly familiar from him originally from Yngwie Malmsteen, Axel Rudy Pell. He did great work with both of those acts. He also was the singing voice for one of the actors in the movie Rockstar with Mark Wahlberg. He played the singing part of the lead singer of the original band, who's kind of the antagonist early on. But yeah, I mean, dude is just phenomenal. Album's great. It feels like a triple A album compared to some of these other, not to knock the other bands, but you feel like they're in different stages of their career. The album art might be a little on the edgy side, but I think the music more than makes up for it.
Yeah, no question about it. I think this is one of the best picks we've had so far in our very short time doing this podcast. So 2 great choices from Chris this week. A lot of great stuff left over for me to choose from, and I went with a couple different sounding bands. The first one was a band called Crazy Lixx with their album 2 Shots at Glory. No surprise that I start off with a European rock band. This band is from Sweden, formed in Malmo in 2002. Obviously, they're a hair band. If you listen to them, there's really no other way to describe them. What they have decided to do with this album is basically remaster and revamp several songs in their catalog. They took some of the deeper cuts from their previous releases, reworked some of them, re-recorded some of them to allow them to basically kind of have an in-between album between new albums that they plan to release. And it's really, really good. They did a great job. There really aren't any bad tracks on here. The ones that I really like, 2 Shots at Glory, Fire It Up, Ain't No Rest in Rock and Roll. But I think if you're into that type of music, you're going to find that this is really one great song after another throughout this entire album. And certainly an interesting way for bands to maybe give some songs that didn't perform as well, or maybe were smaller tracks on album releases, a second life. Like, hey, let's change this up. Let's re-record it. Let's do something different to maybe bring this back in front of people while we're in the process of writing new music for an upcoming album. So definitely worth checking this one out. If you like hair metal, this is a band for you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this album. I think it goes to show you that even though that style of pop metal fell out of favor in the early 90s here, that doesn't mean that there can't be bands after the fact creating new pop metal or hair metal that have something to say. I think you can talk about grunge as being what killed the hair metal over here, but I think in a lot of cases, a lot of those bands had been played out. The major bands had already said their piece. They had their hits, and there wasn't really the substance was becoming lacking. And I think you have younger, newer bands coming out that want to make that sound, but still have a wealth of creativity. That's when you end up with bands like Crazy Lixx.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to say this stuff's still out there, and there's a lot of really talented groups still making it, and it still feels just as fresh as it did back in the 90s. And I think that's a really an encouraging sign. Chris, your thoughts on Crazy Lixx?
Yeah, I'm right there with Mike. It's always fresh to see a band that wants to bring something back from a different decade. I mean, just because the 80s and 90s are gone doesn't mean that the music has to be. So for them to kind of form this to bring back that glam metal, hair metal scene, I'm all for it. I love hair bands. And it's what you would expect from a band that was influenced by Guns N' Roses, Aerosmith, Whitesnake, just the big members of the 80s scene.
Do want to point out, if you happen to find this podcast in Europe, that Crazy Lixx is getting ready to go on tour with Wasp as part of their 40th anniversary tour. So definitely a chance to check them out along with Wasp, which certainly wouldn't be surprised to see them show up at some point on this podcast as well.
Now, to your point about them kind of remastering and remixing some of their classic tracks into a newer release, I have to wonder, I feel like in the last few years, there's kind of been a resurgence of anything 80s, whether it be kind of that pop sound, any of the synth sounds that you hear more of nowadays. I just wonder if they're not maybe trying to ride that wave.
Why not? I would, absolutely. And I think some of these are because of like the streaming world, I think, has brought a lot of this back. Some of it is video games. We got a new GTA game coming out next year. That brought a lot of kind of classic music back when they had their GTA radio type of stuff. So I think you find things like that bring a lot of this music back. And why not? Here's all of our stuff again, just in case you missed it the first time. So interesting thought, I think.
The other really cool thing I think people should check on Crazy Lixx's YouTube page is they have this thing called unofficial soundtracks from the 80s and 90s, where basically they've taken these songs that obviously weren't written in the 80s and 90s. They're their original material, but they've put them to video scenes from movies from the 80s and 90s. There's one for their song, Two Shots at Glory, that is using video footage from the movie Stone Cold, which was a 1991 Brian Bosworth flick. There's another one for the song Ain't No Rest in Rock and Roll, using scenes from the 94 classic movie Airheads. I just think that's a really cool creative idea, and I'd like to see more bands do that.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're going to bring back music from a different era, why not? It's kind of like the whole AMV thing.
Yeah.
Like, why not take your music, put it with something popular from a different time or even a current time, and just another way to promote your music. So definitely check out Crazy Lixx. The other band this week, a Canadian rock band formed in 1981. The band is Honeymoon Suite with their new release Alive. Of course, the band name comes from the fact that they are from Niagara Falls, which is the unofficial honeymoon capital of the world, but just a great classic rock sound. If you like classic rock from the 80s, you're going to love Honeymoon Suite. They toured for years with bands like ZZ Top, Heart, Billy Idol, Journey, Bryan Adams, among others. And this latest release from them would fit in with any one of those groups. Great classic rock sound. I know there's a lot of people online kind of upset that they're not in the Canadian Music Hall of Fame for all their success. Kind of surprising. Standout tracks, Alive, find what you're looking for and Not Afraid to Fail. It's just a great classic rock sound. It's hard to really say much else about it other than it's great to see this band that's been around since 1981 continuing to churn out hits and albums. And it's definitely one that we'll be playing in the background as I work this week because it's just got a great sound.
How many bands are in the Canadian Rock Hall of Fame? I just how have they not gotten the call yet? Once you get through like Rush and Gordon Lightfoot and Triumph, like who's next?
That's a great question.
But yeah, I mean, it's funny because it feels weird to call it classic rock because you always think of classic rock as being more in line with the 70s and not the 80s. I don't know why that is, but it's just quality, like AOR type rock music. They seem like the kind of band that you may not see on the bill when you go see like a classic rock show per se, but when you find out they're the special guest, you're like, oh, that's really cool. I'm glad they're actually part of this tour. It's just, what can I say? They're quality music.
Yeah, it's a great release from this Canadian band. Great to see him continue to roll on. Chris, your thoughts on Honeymoon Suite?
Yeah, it was kind of right up in line with your other pick. Great 80s sound. And I know when we first talked about it, I almost likened it to if John Bon Jovi went a little more alternative. I kind of hear a bit more alternative sound in that. And hopefully bands don't, I don't mention a band in reference that these bands would hate to be attributed to, but it's kind of my easiest way for comparison's sake to kind of give folks an idea of what they sound like.
Yeah. Again, it's sometimes it's kind of hard to find that one thing that really reminds you of that band, because it feels like there's so many influences in some of these bands this week. And this is another one where it's just like, yeah, if you like music that played during the 80s, rock music, stadium rock type stuff, you're probably going to like Honeymoon Suite.
I think that's also a good thing why you should pick Canadian bands, because chances are they won't be offended when you maybe accidentally compare them to a band that they're not as fond of, since, Canadians are just generally nicer.
That's true.
It also begs the question, we often kind of make light of these older bands, band members in the 60s and 70s who still can't get along. I wonder what the percentage of those are that are from Canada. Because, I feel like you're less look at Rush. They were friends right up until the end. You don't hear a lot of drama around Honeymoon Suite.
Probably not.
Just guessing.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. Just, put your differences aside. Life's too short. Just keep making great music. And that's what Honeymoon Suite has continued to do. We're going to step aside. When we come back, we're going into the vault. We're going to each give you one album from the vault that you should definitely check out when we continue on with Music Monday here on the Nerdcast Empire on the other side of this timeout. Back on the Nerdcast Empire, Music Mondays rolls on, and don't forget to check out our website, nerdcastempire.com. You can check out our store there. Go to nerdcastempire.com/store or click the store link at the top of the page, and certainly a lot of great stuff on there. Make sure you check that out. We don't make a ton of money off our store, but it is really more to get our merch out there, and we certainly appreciate any support. Of course, we'll be back with another episode of the podcast coming up on Sunday. We'll be talking video games coming up, and then, of course, 1 week from today, we'll have another episode of Music Monday, and we talk about the releases from February the 23rd. So before we do that, we're going to go into the vault as we wrap up this week's edition, and we're going to each give you an album from the past that you may want to check out at some point. We're going to start with Chris on the trip to the vault first. And Chris, what do you have for your vault pick this week?
My vault pick this week is going to be Rush. I'm going to try to limit how many times I pick Rush, or at least spread it out, because I think I've mentioned on one of our initial episodes they are my favorite band of all time and amazing musicians in their own right. But if I was to pick an album to start this off, I'd have to go with Counterparts. 1993, year I was born. It was even the month I was born that it was released. And I think it's an underrated one for sure, definitely in my top 5 of all Rush albums. I don't think people are going to look for it when they're looking at kind of the moving pictures, 2112's big hits. It doesn't have a whole lot of those, but I think it's strong in its own right. An album all about duality. When Neil Peart was writing these lyrics, you've got songs about hot and cold, male and female, gay or straight. It's got a lot of heavy content lyrically. I think Animate, the opening track on it should be a contender for one of their strongest openings. I know Rush has been great at picking opening tracks on a lot of their albums, and Animate is no different. This album has my favorite instrumental, Leave That Thing Alone. I highly recommend everyone check that out. I like it even more than La Villa Strangiato or YYZ. So definitely check that one out. And one of my main reasons for loving this album is that there was a conscious decision when they were recording it to kind of not completely get rid of all their synth sound, but definitely distance themselves from their synth sound and bring Alex Lifeson more to the forefront and his guitar. And I think you really see it on here. I mean, there was a lot of tension between him and Geddy, I guess, during this time, because even though they were trying to distance themselves, just the sight, kind of seeing these keyboards in the studio kind of put them on edge, like, oh, so we're not really getting rid of it kind of deal. They did it perfectly. I mean, Alex Lifeson is front and center, cut to the chase off this album, maybe one of his best solos of all time, in my opinion. And it's Rush. I mean, I don't think I could name an album that they've done any wrong, but yeah. Top 5 album for me, and definitely one I think everyone should check out.
Before I get into Mike's thoughts on this album, do want to point out, like, this album was produced by Peter Collins, who you may know, in addition to some work with Rush, he produced, I think, about 4 albums for Rush, but he also produced Hey Stupid for Alice Cooper. But maybe most known by the people who would listen to our podcast is he produced Operation Mindcrime and Empire for Queensryche, and certainly Mindcrime may be one of the best concept albums of all time. Yeah. So certainly you're bringing somebody in that's really, really good at what he can do. And I think it kind of comes through in this album.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. It's with like Queensryche and Mind Crime and Empire. It's like those are, even though they're, Mind Crime is out there as far as being a conceptual album, both of those still kind of feel a little more rooted in rock as opposed to some of their earlier work, which can kind of get a little too far on the proggy end, I think. I'm just kind of curious because, I'm not super familiar with Counterparts, but the second I started it and I heard the bass line of Animate, I'm like, yeah, this is going to be good. Like there's a certain feeling you get like, okay, this is what I'm looking for. I wonder what it would have been like to have been a longtime fan of Rush, to kind of go through that roller coaster of their evolving and changing sound over the years. Then you put this on and you're like, wait, are they a rock band again? This is so cool. Like, I wonder what that would have been like at that moment.
Yeah, because they definitely went through the whole cycle. And I know Chris is a big Rush fan, will be taking us kind of through that cycle over the weeks and months to come. But yeah, this is definitely a step back to more of a rock roots, not completely, as Chris said, distancing the synthesizer, but definitely de-emphasizing it to the point where I think if you were really a diehard Rush fan during their most rocking times, I think this is an album that I would guess is right near the top, if not at the top, of your favorite Rush albums of all time.
Yeah, and to Mike's point, kind of be like, if you're in that 90s era, just coming off of the Roll the Bones album where they really were kind of playful. I mean, they even had a section in the title track where they got to rap a little bit, which was insane for Rush to even think about it. But coming off of that and then rolling into this Counterparts album and kind of going back to a pure rock's roots kind of deal.
Yeah, it's a great choice for sure. Definitely want to get back and listen to more of this album. It's been a while since I've had the chance to listen to it, but a really good choice. And interesting that Chris has probably picked the most mainstream pick this week of the vault picks. And I would think, obviously Rush is certainly somebody everybody has listened to if you're a rock fan. I would guess that if you're into video games, you've probably listened to your pick from the vault, or at the very least been influenced by this person's music. But what is your pick from the vault this week, Mike?
Yeah, I was kind of looking for something starting with the letter B, first off.
Correct.
And with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth having just come out, I've been spending some time with that and kind of get you in that mindset of the music from those games, which has been just classic for so many years. So my vault pick for this week is the Black Mages with their second album, To the Skies Above, from 2004.
And obviously, if you're not a video game fan, or maybe not a diehard fan, the name The Black Mages might not specifically lead you to a certain place. But as you mentioned, if you are a fan of Final Fantasy, no question that brings you to a very specific place.
Yeah, absolutely. Nobuo Uematsu, the longtime composer for Square Enix in the Final Fantasy series, was kind of brought into this rock back act by two other composers from the company who had gotten together doing some rock arrangements of various video game music. And they went on to release 3 albums that covered all sorts of areas of the Final Fantasy spectrum, so to speak. I picked the second one, even though I could have picked any of the 3, mainly because it features 2 tracks from Final Fantasy IV, which may or may not be one of the greatest Final Fantasy games of all time. I think it's a personal experience thing. Most people would probably say 6 or 7 or maybe even 10. But for me, given my age and when I encountered Final Fantasy IV as Final Fantasy II on the Super Nintendo, it resonates the most with me. So to have tracks like Zeramis and Battle with the Four Fiends on there with rock renditions of them, both really amazing. Matoya's Cave from Final Fantasy I is also really cool. Let's see, Maybe I'm a Lion from Final Fantasy VIII, The Skies Above from Final Fantasy X. Pretty much whatever Final Fantasy games interest you, you'll find a track from one of them that is just so much better in this rock composition.
Well, it's funny because even as someone who didn't play Final Fantasy, I was around it enough. And I think it's just in being involved with video games enough that so many of these titles, even if you go back to the original Black Mages album, the titles ring a bell, like Clash on the Big Bridge from Final Fantasy V. Even as somebody who didn't play the games, like, you're going to know the music. And if you have been around the games at all, these immediately bring you back to those moments in the game but in a way that kind of transforms it into something different than just the original sounds that came from your video game cartridge.
Yeah, when you think that so many of these were either on 8 or 16-bit home video game consoles, 32 as we went on to PlayStation, there were clearly limitations. So to kind of hear this fully fleshed out realization of this sound, it's definitely worth looking into.
Yeah, no question about that. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Chris, but your thoughts on I guess Final Fantasy music in general, even not specifically the Black Mages.
Yeah, I love that Mike was kind of drawn to this for the same reason I was. The songs from Final Fantasy IV, playing through the series as I've been recently, albeit slowly. 4 is the most recent one I've completed, so it was kind of fresh in my mind. And like you said, Zero Miss and the Four Fiends battle, as many times as it took me to kind of get through some of those battles and how many times I had to hear the music playing, it's almost burned in my brain. But yeah, it's great to hear kind of heavy metal renditions of those songs. And I would dare say that Nobuo Uematsu's not just great at making video game music, but he makes video game music that, I mean, you could easily work out to, or rock out to in general.
Yeah, no question about that. That's such a great choice. And the music from Final Fantasy, among the best video game music of all time, and definitely worth checking out rock versions of some of the classics from the Final Fantasy games. So I went the farthest off the beaten path this week. And again, I kind of started last week, even before I saw your pick. I picked a tribute to a Japanese band, which meant it was a kind of license to continue down that road into the Japanese music style. And again, we're talking about albums that influence my music tastes, and probably wouldn't be doing this podcast, certainly like from an anime standpoint, if not for the music of Megumi Hayashibara, who's maybe one of the all-time great female voice actresses in Japan, now 56 years old, which is kind of crazy, to be honest with you, but has been in maybe some of the biggest shows, and we'll run down some of those in a moment. But specifically spotlighting her album Bertemu, which was released on November the 1st, 1996. It includes maybe some of her biggest songs right off the bat. The first track is Give a Reason, which is the opening theme to Slayer's Next, which could be her best song, very possibly. There's certainly, at some point, maybe we'll go through my list of her greatest music, but that is right up there among the best ones she's done. But there's so many great tracks on this album. She did a bunch of the Slayer's movie OVA songs on this album, including Touch Yourself, Midnight Blue, Shakunetsu no Koi, Shining Girl, Going History. There are Rei Ayanami versions of A Cruel Angel's Thesis and Fly Me to the Moon. Fly Me to the Moon is not a great song, no matter who's singing it, but it's kind of cool to have the in-character versions of those. She's got a couple of other songs on here that maybe aren't necessarily anime related. Hanarete, Itemo, and Life, that were written by Ritsuko Okazaki, who's probably best known as having written and sung the original Fruits Basket open. Of course, she's passed away, but kind of cool that she was involved in writing some music for this album. It peaked at number 3 of the Oricon charts. Megumi Hayashibara has been in probably some of the biggest anime of the 90s and 2000s, including Evangelion, Love Hina, Saber Marionette J, Ranma 1/2, Cowboy Bebop, Slayers, Detective Conan, Pokemon, Shaman King, among hundreds of other titles. I probably wouldn't be as into anime music if not for her music, specifically the stuff that came from Slayers, which was kind of the gateway into getting into J-pop and J-rock.
Yeah, there's no question that she's an icon for that style of music. A couple thoughts I have about that is first, you think this album was released in 1996. A lot of times when I'm watching these older shows, I just think, like, what would the world have been like had that stuff been accessible back then? I just can't imagine being in junior high or freshman year of high school and watching Evangelion. Like, that would have been, first off, I'm not sure I would have liked it at that point in time, but still, that just would have been really bizarre. And also, since I've been going through a lot of seasonal and yearly anime songs, there's a certain kind of template feeling about her music where it's like you're kind of comparing a lot of the stuff to that. Like, it's just almost like she set the bar for the sound you're expecting.
Yeah, it's one of those artists that I wish she would have felt more comfortable touring the U.S. I think probably her height of popularity came before we were getting a lot of Japanese acts. I think if she were the level of popular she is now, she would be coming over to the US and probably would be doing really well in ticket sales because she laid all the groundwork for the big pop groups and rock groups that we have nowadays. And one of my all-time favorites. I don't know, Chris, if you have any thoughts on that. I know anime music really isn't up your alley, but certainly an artist that this certainly is important to me getting into the Japanese style music.
Yeah, I think one of the big things about doing this podcast is it allows me, as kind of a prime example of some of the issues with being just a consumer of media, is you don't always put a name or a face to the work of the artist. So kind of going through and just looking at all the voices, music that she's done over the years and realizing that, yeah, that was kind of a big portion of my childhood. So it's great that I can finally put a face and a name to the work and kind of give the flowers, I guess you could say, to someone who's affected my life so greatly. I mean, like I said, you can't scroll down. It would almost be impossible to list just her voice acting roles. I mean, I probably know her best as Faye Valentine from Cowboy Bebop. And as far as her musical roles, I mean, Fly Me to the Moon and Cruel Angel's Thesis are classics. I'd say even non-anime fans have at least heard those once or twice. So yeah, it's great to finally kind of get a better vision on what I've been listening to over the years.
Yeah, she's definitely one of the all-time greats, and just recently released, I believe it was a 30th anniversary album, I think it was, that kind of goes through her whole career. And recently, I think her most recent song that I know, she did an open for the new Shaman King, which sounded just like her classic stuff. So if you're an anime fan, especially of the 90s, there's no doubt that you have been influenced by her music, and certainly I was as well. That is going to wrap things up for Music Monday. Another week in the books, and there's just never an end in sight to all the great music coming out, which means we will be back with you 1 week from today with the music from February the 23rd. Plus, we'll go back into the vault to give you a whole new set of albums to choose from. A lot of great stuff coming up. We look forward to bringing it to you. Don't forget to check out our website, nerdcastempire.com, to keep up to date on all the things involving the Nerdcast Empire. A huge thanks to Stoveleg Media again for all their continued support of the podcast. A big thanks to Mike and Chris for joining me once again. And until next week, when we talk some more music on Music Monday, this is Matt saying so long. Don't forget to join the Empire, the Nerdcast Empire.